Hey everybody, it's Eric from EPAutos.com, your libertarian car guy. Caught an old interview with Jeremy Clarkson from BBC Top Gear, where they were talking about bad driving and trying to figure out how to identify bad drivers on the road. And at that time, Clarkson made the observation, which I agree with, that you could safely assume that if you rolled up behind, say, a Volvo or a Prius, that more than likely you were going to be dealing with a bad driver, meaning somebody who was oblivious, who tended to drive below the speed limit, who would do things like camp out in the left lane, not yielding to faster traffic, etc., and so on. Fast forward to now, though, and I think the situation is a lot different because effectively all the cars on the road are kind of like Volvos and Priuses. I should actually back up a little bit to clarify more what Clarkson was trying to get at. At that time, and this was back in the 90s, there were still interesting cars, and not just on the very high end. And so people who cared about driving tended to buy cars that were interesting and fun to drive. And that was how you could separate out the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. Getting back to where we are now, almost all the cars that are available at prices that most people can afford are boring transportation appliances. You know, you've heard me rant about crossover SUVs. Oy vey. Here comes another one. I'm going to have to figure out what to say about it. This one's got a 9.5-inch touchscreen, whereas that one over there has an 8-inch touchscreen. There's just not that much difference, and there's certainly not much in the way of excitement or driving fun to be gotten out of it. So, you know, people have been driving these crossover SUVs now for quite some time because they seem to be the only vehicles that are available anymore. So it's no longer really possible to safely assume that whatever you're rolling up behind is being piloted by a bad driver, because you know, there are all these boring, uninteresting cars that pretty much everybody is driving. You know, if you can roll up behind an old muscle car, typically you'll find somebody who still knows how to drive. Not so much, though, with the new stuff, new performance cars, I should say. For example, Corvettes. I've noticed this phenomenon. I've rolled up behind a number of new Corvettes, and more often than not, they're driven in the same way that people that we like to snicker about drove Priuses. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the Corvette is frankly an old man's car at this point. Base price $60,000, and God help you as far as what it costs to insure if you're somebody who's in your 30s, let's say. Just, you know, you have to be very affluent in order to be able to afford to drive a car like a Corvette, which wasn't always the case. You know, at one point in time, yeah, the Corvette was more expensive than, say, a Z28 or a base Camaro, but it was still something that a middle-class guy could conceivably afford before he got to the age of being able to collect Social Security. So now here we are, and that's what the Corvette has become. And I don't think it's an accident that it's automatic only. You know, a lot of guys who do what I do gripe about that, but there's a reason why. I'm not even blaming General Motors for it. General Motors will say, you know, we'd build it with a manual if people would buy it, but they don't. You know, the bulk of the people who buy these cars buy them with automatics, so it doesn't make sense for them to make it with a manual. But why do they do that? Well, because they're old. You know, some old guy who's got bad knees and, you know, just wants to be able to putt around in traffic in a fancy-looking sports car doesn't want to deal with a clutch and shifting gears and all of that. So they're catering to that demographic. So that's why when you roll up behind a Corvette and the guy's doing 56 miles an hour in a 55-mile-an-hour zone, that's why. That helps to explain it. And frankly, the same is true with regard to Mustangs and, you know, the Charger, rest in peace, that was last made in 2023. Again, these have now become so expensive that they essentially are at best for middle-aged guys, if not old guys. And at that point, you know, your testosterone isn't what it was when it was 25, and your willingness to get tickets and to deal with all of the stuff having to do with insurance and traffic court and blah, 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 is probably a lot less. You maybe have a wife, you got kids, you got to be responsible, and so while you'd still like to have a fun car, you know, your willingness to drive it in a fun manner is probably considerably less. So that's where we are now, and I think that's why it seems like 9 out of 10 of the vehicles that you encounter on the road are driven by NPCs. It seems like, you know, people who are just sort of asleep at the wheel, who don't particularly have any interest in driving in other than a transportation sense, you know, to get from A to B. Nothing wrong with that. I just think it's sad that the enthusiasm for driving and the fun that people used to get out of owning a car and, you know, just the open road and all of that stuff. It's just gone now, or at least it's been dramatically reduced. Anyway, those are my thoughts this morning. More over at epautos.com, the web's best libertarian gearhead site. I hope you'll consider swinging by. And if you like what's there, if you like my videos, please recommend them to friends. Very much appreciated, and we'll have more for you again soon.